Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and privilege.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Fijian government, we'd like to welcome you to Fiji and also the other delegates from within Fiji. We'd also like to thank the UN agency, refugee agency, for organizing this together with the Fijian government at this workshop. As highlighted by Albert, he stole most of my speech, but as you can see that the situation pertaining to refugees and asylum seekers is actually a modern day phenomena that does need to be addressed. There are many countries in the world, in fact, that probably do not know how to address it. There are many countries in the world that do not necessarily have all the appropriate laws in place, all the appropriate protocols in place, or indeed, if they have ratified the convention, they may not necessarily have local legislation that's commensurate with what the actual convention demands of the domestic jurisdiction. And I think these are some of the challenges, and hopefully in the couple of days of workshop that you'll have, you'll be able to eke out those issues. I think, apart from before I address the sort of moral and ethical issue pertaining to refugees and refugee status, there's no doubt that many of our lawyers, and I can speak specifically for Fiji, whilst we ratified the convention back in 1972 and the various protocols, there is still a need to review the law vis-a-vis the convention, because we've taken the law up to a particular stage, but we have not addressed it beyond that from a practical perspective. So if, for example, a person has been granted refugee status, what are their rights pertaining to, say, right to have a living, in terms of right to have a work permit? What are the rights pertaining to, for example, the children? Do they have access to, we have free education in Fiji. Do they have access to free education? We have also now, a tertiary education loan scheme for universities. Do they have access to legal aid? I mean, we have the legal aid representatives over here. None of these areas specifically are enunciated. One could, of course, look at our Constitution. And our Constitution talks about, the Bill of Rights being not only vertically applicable, but also horizontally being applicable. So it applies both to private and state actors within the whole, the state sphere. So all of these need to be actually eked out, and we need to think about it. A lot of it, of course, is policy considerations. There are various conventions that we have ratified. We do have a constitution that's very liberal in terms of its application to both socioeconomic and civil and political rights. So how far do those rights, for example, apply to people who may not necessarily be citizens but are refugees? On the other flip side, of course, whilst we recognize the fact that refugee issues are very, very important. In fact, you can see nearly every day, if you switch on the television sets, there are movement of people everywhere, within continents, outside continents, from one continent to another continent. And whilst there are a lot of moral issues pertaining to that, there's also I know some agencies have had discussions with us previously saying, well, look, we have a right to protect our borders. And we cannot allow people, for example, to just simply come in. We have a small economy, we have very fragile economies, and there's a particular level of dependency that will actually, create. So it is in fact a matter, it's a very practical matter. And so I'm sure some of your immigration departments, those of you representing the different immigration departments, would have that in consideration. So the idea is that we need to be able to recognize and start from the premise about the dignity of the human being. Whoever that human being is, they may not be a citizen of your country, they may have some very genuine reasons as to why they may be seeking asylum status or seeking refugee status. On the other hand, then you have the practical side of the processing of various applications they may make. Then, of course, the third side is about how does the policy of the government sit in vis-a-vis international law. And sometimes we've found in many countries, one can talk about Australia in respect of international obligations, and how they themselves have actually dealt with people seeking refugee status, and whether there are contradictions or whether there is a hypocritical position taken in respect to that. So I think all of these, they're not necessarily easy answers to that. Of course, we have asylum seekers now placed in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. There are a number of issues pertaining to that. The UNHCR has made a number of observations. So has the Human Rights Commissioner's Office have made a number of observations. So all of these aren't necessarily, easy issues. And I think hopefully what this workshop will actually be able to do is eke out some of those issues and be able to discuss them quite openly and freely. And I think that is very, very important to do that. And we ourselves in Fiji, of course, have a lot to learn from your experiences, and we can, of course, impart what we have experienced ourselves. I mean, I read somewhere where in a particular country, a person was given refugee status because he was a homosexual, and he was being discriminated against in his country because I think there was a raid in a couple of nightclubs that was essentially open for homosexuals. Then when he was given refugee status in the country in which he applied for the refugee status, he then in a few years' time entered into a heterosexual relationship and had children. And the immigration department then sort of tried to expedite him getting citizenship. Now, questions were raised about, well, he came into the country on the basis of him being a homosexual, but now the immigration department is expediting his citizenship status. He was given refugee status, now getting citizenship because he's now in a heterosexual relationship. So there are a lot of policy makers who are asking the question, what has happened? Of course, people have on one hand freedom of the ability to change the sexual orientation. On the other hand, some people may actually question that, why was this refugee status granted in the first place? Because of the change in orientation now. So, I mean, these are not very easy issues. And there also means that as border control people and people who are also deciding issues pertaining to, or policies pertaining to the border, we need to be able to ensure that there is integrity within the systems, that the processing has integrity, that the processing has transparency, and that is very, very important. And the agency, of course, is here to help you with that, to be able to make it a lot more transparent. Because we cannot sometimes, what actually has happened in many countries, and as has been highlighted by Albert, you do also get some very sort of xenophobic type of ideas and approaches. We are being overwhelmed. And in fact, the reason why I had this paper here is I was looking at the statistics. They're saying that 39% of the world's displaced people are hosted in the Middle East. North Africa has 39%. 39% of the world's displaced people are hosted in the Middle East and North Africa. 29% are in the rest of Africa. 12% in the Americas. 6% in Europe. And 14% in the Asia-Pacific region. So you can, for example, see that we do see a lot of footage on CNN or BBC about so many people going to Europe. But in fact, that constitutes only 6% of the total number of people who are seeking refugee status. But we do not necessarily see the 39% that are actually seeking refugee status in the Middle East and North Africa. So again, like I said, that it is very much an issue that can be either diminished or highlighted depending on who's giving you the news, who's giving you the story, where the emphasis is being placed. So sometimes there can be a lot of pressure on the people at the border because of the extraneous factors that may be, around you on the periphery. So, ladies and gentlemen, the other point that I think it'd be amiss of me to mention, as Albert had also said, about the fact that we in the Pacific will have some internal displacements very soon in time to come. We have countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, where the land above sea level is very, very low. I think in Tuvalu's case, about 12 feet above sea level is the highest peak above the sea level. So, we have, Fiji has openly said, for example, we're willing to offer them some form of refuge if, for example, the land starts to sink. Now, a lot of that can happen. It's a reality. In Fiji ourselves, we have relocated 3 villages to higher ground. There's another about 49 that have been identified that actually could fall prey to the encroaching seas. So these are some very real issues. Now, what happens, for example, to those people who may, for example, no longer can live on their islands? If there are various atolls, if you have a village on a particular island, what happens? And if they are from another country, what will be their legal status if they want to move, for example, to Fiji? What will be, for example, issues pertaining to territoriality? How are you going to measure your EEZ? Can we measure EEZ from a land that used to be above water and now is submerged? These are, various legal issues that we do need to ask. And in terms of the citizenship, in terms of how do we treat them, do we put them in a different category altogether? So I think it is very critical for us to be able to have that, at a policy level, that intellectual discussion, and it's something that's around the corner. If, for example, the problem is not arrested very quickly and in a very dramatic manner, then the rising sea levels will affect many countries. I was told that in the way that the sea levels are rising, a country like Bangladesh, 17% of Bangladesh would go underwater because most of Bangladesh is very flat. So 17% of Bangladesh would go underwater. It's got a population, I think, of nearly about 150 million, approximately. So how much of that, how many of those people live in that 17% of the land is obviously anybody's guess. But again, they may have internal displacements, but they may actually flee to other countries. So rising sea levels, climate change is a very real issue that we also need to be able to address and think about. We have at the Attorney General set up a small unit. We've allocated some funding to be able to look at some of these legal issues that may have actually, are on the periphery of the Paris Agreement. But that's something definitely that we do need to discuss, and indeed it's something that the agency will need to deal with in a lot more substantial manner in a few years' time, because it will become a substantial issue. So ladies and gentlemen, with those few words, I hope I've tried to eke out some of the issues and help provide some food for thought for you in the next couple of days of your discussions. I would like to thank you for your participation, and of course we'd like to thank the agency and Albert and his team. Thank you for being here, and thank you for providing this opportunity for us, and I wish you all a very good morning. Thank you. Here is